It was a busy afternoon at the airport. People were rushing in every direction, hurrying to board their flights or rushing to catch a connecting flight. Among the crowd stood a well-dressed man, looking calm and collected. He had the kind of presence that made people look twice. His clothes were neatly pressed, his shoes polished to perfection, but there was something about him that didn't quite fit in with the rest of the travelers. He was not rushing, not worried about missing his flight. He had an air of confidence, of quiet power. As he moved through the terminal, passing by the long lines at check-in counters and the crowded lounges, it was clear that he was used to the finer things in life. His calmness set him apart from the flurry of movement around him. People stared for a moment but quickly looked away, unsure whether to approach or just continue with their own busy lives. The airline crew, including a young air hostess, was preparing for the next flight. She was in charge of the section for first-class passengers, an area of the plane where the most important and wealthy guests would sit. She had only been working at the airline for a few months and was eager to make a good impression. However, she didn't always handle the pressures of the job well, especially when it came to passengers who didn't seem to fit the ideal image of a first-class traveler. As the passengers began boarding, the hostess noticed the man from earlier. He moved toward the first-class line, and she couldn't help but notice him. He didn't look like someone who belonged in the expensive seats. His demeanor was calm, but there was something about his appearance that made her think he didn't have the type of money or class she associated with the wealthy travelers she usually served. Still, she smiled politely, as she had been trained to do, and offered him a seat. As the man took his place, she didn't think much more about it, until a moment later when she passed by him again. She asked if he needed anything and immediately assumed he would ask for a drink or something special. When he simply asked for some water, she was surprised, but she didn't think much of it. But there was something about his quiet composure that irritated her. Maybe it was the way he seemed so relaxed, as though he wasn't at all concerned with the luxury of the surroundings. Maybe it was the way he wasn't overly polite, but she dismissed it quickly as she moved on with her duties. The man continued to sit calmly in his seat, watching the busy activity around him. He didn't rush to do anything. He didn't make a fuss about the little things that often seemed to frustrate other passengers. But little did she know, the man she had dismissed as just another regular passenger was someone far more important than she could ever imagine. As the plane took off and the seatbelt sign was turned off, the cabin settled into a quiet rhythm. The air hostess moved up and down the aisles, offering drinks and checking on passengers. Everything seemed calm, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the man she had seen earlier. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something different about him. He had this quiet, calm confidence, unlike the usual passengers she dealt with. Yet, despite her initial judgment, she couldn't figure out why he stood out. The man hadn't asked for anything extravagant. He had simply sat there, quietly, as if nothing about the luxury flight mattered to him. In fact, she hadn't heard him speak much at all since boarding, which, in her mind, only confirmed her assumptions. People who were really important, in her experience, usually wanted more attention, more services, more requests. But he seemed content, like he didn't care about the little things. This made her a bit uneasy, and it was starting to show in her interactions with him. As she made her way down the aisle again, she found herself looking at him one more time. She noticed that he was sitting with perfect posture, reading a book quietly, yet there was something about his calmness that almost felt too much. It made her feel like she was being watched, and she didn't like it. She was used to being the one in control, especially in a space where she was supposed to make sure everything was perfect. It seemed to her that this man was too comfortable, too easygoing. In her mind, it didn't make sense. She stalked by his seat, and this time, a bit of irritation crept into her tone. She asked if he needed anything, but her words were more of an expectation than a polite offer. "You sure you don't need anything else?" she asked with a slight edge in her voice. It was a subtle challenge, testing his response. The man, still not reacting to the pressure in her tone, simply shook his head. "No, thank you. "I'm good," he said in a quiet, calm voice that matched his earlier demeanor. For a moment, the hostess paused, unsure what to say. There was something disarming about the way he spoke, something that made her feel as if she were the one out of place, not him. Without giving much thought to it, she muttered something under her breath and moved on, not realizing how much her judgment of him was starting to cloud her actions. She couldn't get over the idea that there was something wrong with how little attention he seemed to need, how different he seemed from the usual wealthy passengers she was accustomed to serving. But what she didn't know, as she went back to her duties, was that she was about to make a mistake that would change everything. The man she had treated as just another passenger was, in fact, someone who had more influence and power than she could ever imagine. And when the confrontation between them happened, it would not only reveal her mistake, but set off a chain of events that would make her rethink everything she thought she knew about people and assumptions. The flight continued smoothly, and the air hostess worked her way down the aisles, making sure all passengers were settled and had what they needed. She had gotten used to the usual requests: extra pillows, drinks, snacks. But today, something about the man was starting to bother her more than it should have. He was still sitting in his seat, reading his book, not asking for anything, not complaining. It was almost as if he were ignoring the luxury around him, which made her feel unsettled. As she passed by him once again, her frustration began to rise. She couldn't put her finger on it, but something about the way he carried himself rubbed her the wrong way. It was as though he didn't appreciate what he had, didn't appreciate the privilege of being able to afford such a flight. Maybe it was the way he was acting, so detached, so nonchalant, as if he didn't even care about the comfort around him. To her, it seemed like he didn't belong in first class at all. In a sudden burst of irritation, she stopped at his seat again. This time, her voice had a sharpness that wasn't there before. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her tone a little too harsh. "You don't seem like you're enjoying yourself. You sure you don't need anything more?" Her words were pointed, as if she were testing him, wanting to see if he would finally show some reaction. The man looked up from his book, his expression unchanged. He gave her a brief glance, and then returned to what he was doing. "I'm fine," he replied calmly, without any trace of frustration or impatience in his voice. The hostess's eyes narrowed slightly, but she tried to mask it with a forced smile. Deep down, something was pushing her to challenge him more. Maybe it was her sense of superiority, or maybe it was her judgment of him, which she couldn't seem to shake. She leaned in a little closer, her voice lowering, but still holding a sharp edge. "Are you sure?" she pressed, her words almost mocking. "You know, some people would do anything to be in your place right now." The man didn't respond right away, and the seconds felt like an eternity to the hostess. She waited for him to flinch, to react in some way. But instead, he simply looked at her and shook his head. "I'm fine," he repeated. She felt a wave of frustration flood through her. Why wasn't he reacting like everyone else? Why wasn't he eager for more attention, for more service? She couldn't stand how different he was. His calmness seemed almost like an insult to her, as if he was somehow above it all, beyond what she could offer. And for a brief moment, she felt a wave of superiority. She was in control of the situation, after all. She was the one who could make his experience better or worse. Her irritation began to grow, and she made a rash decision. Without thinking it through, she raised her hand. In a swift motion, she slapped him across the face, expecting him to react the way she imagined. A gasp, a shocked expression, maybe even a plea for forgiveness. But instead, he remained silent, still looking at her without any sign of anger or emotion. The slap hung in the air, its sharp sound echoing through the cabin. And for a moment, the entire plane went silent. The other passengers froze, some too shocked to react, others whispering among themselves. The hostess stood there, realizing instantly that she had crossed a line. She had done something that, in hindsight, felt completely out of place. Yet the man didn't flinch. He didn't yell. He didn't even look angry. He simply looked back at her with a calmness that unsettled her even more. For the first time since boarding the plane, she felt her own confidence slipping away. What had she just done? What had she provoked by acting on her assumptions? The slap hung in the air like a heavy cloud, its sound still ringing in the cabin as the tension quickly escalated. The air hostess stood frozen, her hand still hovering in the space between them. For a split second, she thought she saw a flicker of surprise in the man's eyes, but it quickly disappeared, replaced by an emotionless calmness. He didn't react in anger, didn't raise his voice, or even shift in his seat. He simply looked at her, and his gaze seemed far too steady, far too unbothered for her liking. The other passengers had stopped what they were doing. Some of them were too shocked to even whisper, while others exchanged uneasy glances. The air hostess felt a sharp pang of embarrassment as she realized the full scope of what she had just done. She had acted out of frustration, but now, the gravity of the situation was beginning to sink in. What had she just done? She had slapped a passenger, someone she had assumed didn't deserve respect. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the decision she had just made. And then something strange happened. The man didn't stand up in anger, didn't shout at her or ask for the airline manager. Instead, he did something that completely caught her off guard. Without saying a word, he slowly pulled out his phone from his pocket. The air hostess watched, confused and curious, as he tapped a few things on the screen, his face still perfectly calm. For a brief moment, she stood there in silence, not knowing what to do next. She could feel the weight of the eyes on her, and the guilt began to settle in her chest. She had never thought she would find herself in a situation like this, especially not as a newcomer to the airline. She had always prided herself on being confident, on knowing how to handle her passengers. But now she was standing in front of a man she had underestimated, and her actions had clearly crossed a line. The man didn't look up from his phone, his expression still unreadable. The air hostess felt a cold sweat forming on the back of her neck. She stood there, her mouth dry, unsure of what to say or do. Should she apologize? Or should she just walk away and pretend like nothing had happened? But the man's lack of response only made her more nervous. She wanted him to react, wanted him to yell at her, to make her feel justified in the anger she had felt moments ago. But instead, he stayed silent, his eyes glued to the screen of his phone. As the seconds ticked by, the air hostess could feel her stomach tightening with anxiety. She had no idea what was going through his mind, but she had the unsettling feeling that she was about to find out. And then, just as she was about to speak, the flight attendant came up to her side. He whispered something in her ear, so quietly that only she could hear. The words were brief, but enough to send a shiver down her spine. "He's not just any passenger," the flight attendant said, his voice barely audible. "That man is a billionaire, a major shareholder in this airline's competitor. You've just made a very big mistake." The air hostess froze, her breath caught in her throat. Her heart skipped a beat as the reality of what she had done began to hit her. This man, the one she had treated with such indifference, was someone far more important than she could have ever imagined. Her hands suddenly felt clammy, her confidence completely shattered. The realization was like a punch to the stomach. She had no idea what she had just set in motion. What would happen next? What would the airline do when they found out what she had done? The air hostess stood there, her mind racing as the flight attendant's words echoed in her head. A billionaire? A major shareholder in a competing airline. The shock of it made her feel dizzy. She couldn't believe it. How had she been so careless? How had she misjudged someone so completely? Her hands shook slightly, and she forced herself to take a deep breath, trying to stay calm despite the chaos swirling in her thoughts. The flight attendant's warning lingered in the air, and she could see him watching her with a mix of concern and curiosity. She knew that her mistake was now bigger than just a small disagreement. She had slapped a man who was far more important than she could have ever imagined, and the consequences of her actions could be far-reaching. The realization sent a wave of panic through her. The man, still seated, hadn't moved a muscle. His calmness only made the situation feel more surreal. She expected him to stand up and demand to speak to the captain, or at least make some kind of scene. But instead, he remained still, his attention fixed on his phone. It was as if he didn't even care about what had just happened. This indifference made her feel even more uneasy, and she began to wonder if he was just silently calculating what to do next. As the minutes passed, the air hostess became more and more aware of the growing tension in the cabin. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, some of them probably wondering why the situation hadn't been resolved yet. She didn't know how to handle this. She had never been in a situation like this before, and the fear of losing her job started to settle in her chest. It wasn't long before the captain and a couple of senior flight attendants appeared at the front of the cabin. The air hostess's heart raced as they made their way down the aisle toward the man. They were calm, but their presence only made her feel smaller. The captain approached the man first, speaking to him in a low voice, asking if everything was okay. The man didn't respond immediately, still focused on his phone, but there was a slight shift in his posture as he glanced up, his eyes meeting the captain's. The senior flight attendants exchanged glances before one of them spoke to the air hostess in a hushed tone. "You need to come with us," they said, and there was no mistaking the seriousness in their voices. The air hostess felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. Her heart pounded in her chest as she followed them toward the back of the plane. She couldn't help but feel as though her entire world was slipping out of her control. This was no longer just a minor issue. She had no idea how this was going to unfold, but she had a sinking feeling that it wasn't going to end well. The moment they reached the back of the plane, the senior flight attendants turned to face her. "What exactly happened?" one of them asked, a frown on their face. She opened her mouth to explain, but no words came out at first. She had no excuse, no reason for what she had done. All she could do was tell them what had happened, how her frustration had led her to act impulsively, without thinking. The air hostess could feel the weight of her actions pressing down on her. She had slapped a man, a billionaire, who could have easily ruined her career with a single phone call. The realization made her stomach churn. She had no idea what was going to happen next, but she knew it would be bad. The senior attendants exchanged a few quiet words before turning back to her. "You need to stay here," they said, their tone final. "We need to speak to the airline's management." The air hostess nodded, her mind racing. She had no idea how much trouble she was in, but she knew that this moment would change everything. The air hostess sat in the small staff area at the back of the plane, feeling like the walls were closing in around her. The hours seemed to stretch out as she waited, her mind spinning in a million directions. She had been instructed to stay there until the management arrived to handle the situation, but all she could think about was the man she had slapped. How had she let her emotions get the best of her? What had possessed her to act so impulsively without thinking of the consequences? She couldn't stop replaying the moment over and over in her head. The shock on the other passengers' faces, the complete silence in the cabin after the slap, and the calm way the man had reacted. It was as if he had been unfazed by her actions, almost as if he knew something she didn't. The guilt of what she had done was crushing her. But it was also the uncertainty that bothered her the most. What would happen next? Would she lose her job? Would the airline cover for her? Or would this be the end of her career? After what felt like an eternity, the door to the staff area finally opened, and two senior managers stepped inside. They didn't waste any time, their expressions serious as they looked directly at her. Without any pleasantries, one of them spoke. "We need to know exactly what happened," he said, his voice calm but firm. The air hostess felt her throat tighten, and she had to fight the urge to panic. She knew she had no way of getting out of this. There was no excuse for her behavior. Slowly, she told them everything. The irritation she had felt, the assumption that the man didn't belong in first class, the confrontation, and then the slap. She explained how it had all escalated so quickly, how she hadn't thought about the consequences in the heat of the moment. As she spoke, She could see the managers exchanging glances, their expressions unreadable. They were listening carefully, but the tension in the room was thick. When she finished, there was a long silence. The managers didn't immediately say anything, which only made her feel more nervous. She wanted to say something else, to explain herself better, but she couldn't find the words. Finally, one of the managers spoke, his tone less harsh than before, but still serious. "Do you realize who you slapped?" he asked. The question sent a chill through her. She nodded slowly, still unable to believe what had happened. She knew the man was important, but she hadn't fully grasped the extent of it until now. He wasn't just another wealthy passenger. He was a billionaire, a key player in the airline industry, and someone with a lot of influence. The reality of what she had done began to sink in, and she felt even worse. The second manager spoke up, his voice slightly softer. "This is serious. This isn't just a small mistake. We'll need to speak with the passenger before we can decide what to do next." The air hostess's heart sank. She felt trapped, unable to escape the consequences of her actions. She had no idea what the man would do or what he would say to the airline management. Would he press charges? Would he demand her immediate dismissal? The uncertainty gnawed at her, and she began to feel the weight of her entire career hanging in the balance. As the managers left to speak with the man, the air hostess sat in silence, her mind racing. She couldn't stop thinking about what she could have done differently, about how her snap judgment had led to this moment. All she could do now was wait and hope that somehow she would be given a second chance. But deep down, she knew that the outcome of this situation was out of her hands. What would happen next was entirely up to the man and the choices he would make. The air hostess sat in the small staff room, feeling like she was in limbo. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as she waited for the managers to return with news. She had never felt so unsure of herself, and the weight of her mistake hung heavily on her shoulders. She kept replaying the moment in her mind, the slap, the look in the man's eyes, his calm response, and the more she thought about it, the worse she felt. How had she misjudged him so badly? What had she been thinking? But then the door opened again, and this time, the senior managers entered, followed by the man. Her heart skipped a beat as she looked up at him, trying to read his expression. He was still as composed as ever, his face unreadable. There was no sign of anger, no sign of the outrage she had expected. If anything, he seemed almost detached. It was as if he wasn't bothered by what had happened at all. The managers stood beside him, and one of them spoke first. "We've spoken with the passenger, and after a long conversation, he has decided not to pursue any immediate action." The air hostess felt a rush of relief flood through her, but it was quickly replaced by guilt. She didn't deserve this kindness. She had slapped a man, and he was choosing not to make her pay for it. She could hardly believe it. The senior manager continued. However, he did have something to say. "He wants you to understand that your actions were not acceptable, but he's willing to let it go as long as you truly learn from this mistake." His voice was steady, but there was a sense of finality in it. The air hostess nodded, still unable to find the words. She was filled with a mixture of gratitude and shame. She had expected punishment, or at least some form of reprimand. Instead, this man, someone she had treated so poorly, was offering her an opportunity for growth, not retribution. The man finally spoke, his voice calm and even. "I don't believe in holding grudges over small things," he said. "People make mistakes. What matters is whether they learn from them." He paused for a moment, then added, "I've seen enough of people who are quick to judge others. But in this case, I see someone who is genuinely remorseful." His words were steady, but they held a weight that made the air hostess feel as though he was offering her a chance at redemption. The air hostess couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had expected to be fired, or at the very least, disciplined severely. But instead, he was giving her the opportunity to reflect on her actions. It was almost too good to be true. She felt tears well up in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away, not wanting to appear weak. I'm so sorry, she managed to say, her voice shaking slightly. I shouldn't have judged you the way I did. I was wrong, and I know that now. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. The man nodded, his expression softening just slightly. We all make mistakes, he said, his tone not as cold as before, but not overly warm either. But the important thing is to be better moving forward. He turned to the senior manager and gave a slight nod. With that, the managers left the room, and the air hostess was left alone with her thoughts. She felt like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders, but at the same time, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had been given a second chance she didn't fully deserve. She had been ready to face the consequences of her actions, but the man's decision to let it go had caught her completely off guard. The flight continued, and the air hostess went back to her duties, but her mind kept returning to the man's words. He had not only chosen to forgive her, but he had also given her something far more valuable, a lesson. He had shown her that people were more than their appearances, more than the assumptions others made about them. And he had reminded her that change was possible, as long as one was willing to learn from their mistakes. The rest of the flight felt almost surreal for the air hostess. She went through the motions of serving passengers, making announcements, and ensuring everything was running smoothly, but her mind was constantly elsewhere. She couldn't shake the conversation she had just had with the man, and his words continued to echo in her mind. What matters is whether they learn from them. Every time she thought about what had happened, she felt a mix of gratitude and embarrassment. She had been given a second chance, a rare opportunity that she knew she couldn't take for granted. As the plane began its descent, she found herself looking out of the small airplane window, lost in thought. She had expected the worst, but instead, she had been shown something far more important: the power of understanding, forgiveness, and personal growth. The man had seen her mistake for what it was, just that, a mistake. And in a world where people were quick to judge and hold grudges, he had chosen a different path. He had given her a chance to change, not just for the sake of her job, but for herself. When the plane landed and the passengers began to disembark, she watched as the man stood up from his seat. He was calm as always, not bothered by the tension that had surrounded them earlier. As he passed her on his way out, he gave her a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of the moment they had shared. She couldn't help but smile faintly in return, grateful for his kindness. But the experience didn't end there. As the days passed, she found herself reflecting more on what had happened. She realized that the situation wasn't just about the mistake she had made. It was about the lesson that came with it. She had learned to look beyond her initial judgments and to be more mindful of how she treated others. It wasn't just about making sure she didn't repeat the same mistake again. It was about becoming a better person, one who didn't let her assumptions cloud her actions. Over the next few weeks, she made a conscious effort to change her attitude. She became more patient with passengers, more understanding of their individual needs. She found herself appreciating the diversity of people she encountered every day, realizing that each person had their own story, their own struggles, and their own worth. She was no longer the same person who had made that impulsive mistake on the flight. The incident had humbled her, but it had also opened her eyes to the importance of treating others with respect, no matter who they were or what they looked like. The man's decision to forgive her had changed her life, but it also made her reflect on the power of kindness and understanding. She had expected punishment, but instead, she had received something far more valuable: a chance to grow and learn from her actions. She realized that sometimes the most impactful lessons came from the most unexpected places. As she continued her work, she carried the lesson with her. She knew she would never forget the experience, and it would shape how she interacted with others for the rest of her life. The man had taught her more than just a lesson about forgiveness. He had taught her that change was possible, no matter how big or small the mistake, as long as one was willing to learn and make the effort to do better.